Welcome to Cloud on Air, live webinars from Google Cloud. We are hosting webinars every Tuesday. My name is Alex Bain. I'm the head of marketing analytics at Nest. I'm here with Jesse Nichols, the head of growth at Nest. And today we'll be talking about how Nest uses Google Cloud and Tableau to drive its business. You can ask questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. Let's get started.
Great. So first of all, since Alex is a marketer and I run growth primarily from the standpoint of growth analytics and experimentation, this presentation will be through how we drive the business through that lens. We use Google Analytics to drive a huge portion of our marketing analysis, and since we use Analytics 360, we also leverage the integration that sends all of your website analytics data into Google BigQuery, of course, within the cloud. So to begin, we'll talk first about why you would use Tableau versus just using the Google Analytics interface to do marketing analytics, how you could get extra insights from that. Then we'll talk more about why you would connect through BigQuery versus the Google Analytics API, which Tableau also has a native integration with. And finally, we'll end with some tips and tricks to get you off to the races.
Perfect. So let's talk about Tableau versus the GA interface. So both tools are capable of segmenting users and visualizing data. So how do you decide when you want to use one versus the other? For Google Analytics, channel reporting is very quick and easy. If you just want to understand sessions from a specific channel like display, you can get that very fast in GA. Additionally, AdWords, so shopping ads, YouTube DoubleClick, Search Console data, a handful of these dimensions and metrics simply aren't available through the API, and GA is a great resource in those cases. And then finally, simple answers to simple questions. So sometimes you just need to grab one metric, a one metric answer to a question, and no reason to go beyond GA in those cases. So channel reporting, for example, like sometimes you get a request about a specific flighted campaign and how it performed. It's just easier to get that in GA if it's a click away, and you can bookmark that, send it out to stakeholders as well. So then, when do you use Tableau? So if you have multiple data sources, for example, you can flow in the product hierarchy. So if you want to group a number of SKUs a certain way, very easy to create that that reference table and change it dynamically, as needed as new products come out, and have Tableau sort of pointed there and grouping data that way. So pre-click marketing data, anything you're doing offline, for example, you can create that as another data source that you would fold in alongside all of the GA data that you have flowing in. Custom dashboards. So dashboards are great for tracking campaign or channel performance, and marketers love pretty dashboards, which Tableau makes it very easy to build. So if you want to create multiple views of multiple metrics all in one place, very easy to do that in Tableau. And then finally, performance versus goals. So if you establish goals at the beginning of the year and you have those documented somewhere, and that you see that in the visual here where you have kind of gray bars referencing the goals, then you can flow in the actuals through BigQuery into Tableau each week that compares how you did against your goals. Very helpful as a kind of ongoing reference in, say, like a weekly stakeholder meeting.
Exactly. And similarly, when you're doing site analysis or growth optimization analysis, Google Analytics is a fantastic tool for just digging around and exploring the data. I mean, first and foremost, when someone is asking a straightforward question, a single answer question, it's just way easier to go through the interface and find it in the canned report. So if like someone's asking how did this one URL do from a temporary campaign we just launched, or what's the percent of mobile traffic, or what's the percent of EU traffic from this specific country, a lot of that analysis, it's a single answer, not going to have to go get it again, find it in GA, give it, move on. Again, even when the data consumer is myself, it's often a lot easier to start an exploratory analysis from within Google Analytics. If there was a recent issue where I was trying to find if there were any browser versions affected by a site update, technology update, and it was just easier to dig through the interface, find out what, if anything, was at risk, and give an answer to that. Finally, the reason that I would use Google Analytics as opposed to Tableau for analysis is this kind of segmentation tool that GA provides, where it's basically a WYSIWYG query builder. And this concept's going to come back in full force when we talk about BigQuery. But this tool that you see in the screenshot there allows you to kind of functionally put together the rudimentary basics of a query and get a single answer, a single metric to a single question. Even if you don't save that segment, it's a pretty handy tool. But it's got its limits. Now, in Tableau, I totally agree. Fully custom dashboards, you just can't go wrong with what you can do in Tableau. I mean, you can go plenty wrong, but usually the handcuffs are off to a large degree in what you're trying to design and build. The GA dashboards are quite limited. They're quite constricting, but with Tableau, you've got design, colors. You're really putting together a full dashboard. So I love that I can kind of have my marketers, give my marketers something that they can self-serve with and anticipate their needs. And then there's a handful of features, again, that you can do inside the GA interface, just a lot easier when you're in Tableau, such as providing filters to limit the amount of data or change the data that someone's seeing within a dashboard, and even controlling exactly which filters you get, which dimensions you're filtering on. So that kind of stuff, again, way better through Tableau. And then finally, again, these are technologies that we leverage in great detail when we start to flow in BigQuery data, but even just your normal Tableau interface is far better at slicing your data by a certain dimension or helping you differentiate between line or bar charts through coloring and other classic data viz techniques. So I think that it's very situational, but Tableau gives us a lot more flexibility when we're trying to share out data. Okay, so once you've kind of had a sense of when you would use Tableau over GA, it begs the question of, well, why wouldn't you just be using the Google Analytics API, which is already within Tableau? What's the extra benefit you get through BigQuery?
Sure. So both are just a click away, as you can see in the visuals here, as you're setting up a new Tableau file. Very easy to pull in GA directly through that API, or BigQuery directly through that API. But if you go the GA route and you're working with a relatively large data set, you can be waiting a long time. So BigQuery comes back about as fast as the cloud can get it to you. So for example, if you're looking at multi-year data sets and you're trying to understand kind of seasonality trends, you're going to get into sampled data on if you're using the GA interface, and you won't know as you're looking at noise if that is due to seasonality or if that is due to sampling. So the BigQuery interface or API helps a bunch in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times I've been asked about some very small metric that is very important, very business critical, but it's like a needle in a haystack. And even with robust sampling, you just don't even, data's almost not usable at a certain level, certainly as you go back in time. So I know you and I have been involved in a lot of analysis projects where precision is just necessary. Yes. And BigQuery, you just have no reason to give up precision.
Yep. Jesse.
So, I think as an analyst, certainly as someone who spends probably 80–90% of my time in analytics tools, having unlimited control over the segmentation you're doing within the data is incredibly powerful. And it's also incredibly frustrating when you know the answers in the data and you just can't get to it. So, the limit here is that within Tableau's GA connection, you are limited basically to GA's segment builder. You have to use the segmentation builder that I showed before in GA's interface before you port it over to Tableau. And there are a whole bunch of things that you just can't build in that thing that just feel just out of reach. Specifically, when you have, let's say, a pretty standardized event naming structure, the same event could fire from multiple pages. You can't really tie those two things together in the GA segment builder. But as an e-commerce shop, just knowing certain product combinations being purchased together, again, just one of the limits of the GA segment builder, you can't build these kind of multi-product combinations or adding multiple products to your cart over one journey. You can really only analyze one product at a time. So it's kind of a showstopper for a company like Nest. But really, pretty much any hit-level logic you're constrained from doing in the GA segment builder. While in BigQuery, you can see I shamefully use legacy SQL to flag segments with pretty much any segment logic that I want. And the idea is that that logic that you're putting in there is all hit level, and if you need to reconcile sessions that have multiple hits within one session, then you just stack a bunch of these and use and/or rules, just like you would in the segment builder in some sort of outer query, and boom, you have any segment you could want to build. You could investigate any set of users that you'd want. It was really a freeing moment as an analyst when I finally put all these pieces together and was like, oh, okay, yeah, game on. It was a nice moment. So I strongly encourage digging into this if you haven't used the GA data in BigQuery before. The thing that you can stack on from there, however, is, I think, an order of magnitude more powerful. So within, again, as an analyst, you're trying to find business insights that are relative to their total scale or relative to the context of the greater business, which is really about a calculated metric. A flat standard metric, it's kind of like, is that a big number? Is that a large percent of our sales? And so these calculated metrics are critical. They're just absolutely vital to understanding, these ratios are vital to understanding the health of the business or the health of some metric you're pursuing. And the constraint with both GA's segment builder and the Tableau connection to GA is that you can segment some session metric and then you can segment some other session metric, but because these are different segments, the numbers have no relationship to each other. You can't just divide one on top of another to create a new calculated metric, because again, that segment is applied to all data in the structure, and you're just kind of hamstrung. And you got to do a lot of work to torture that out of the tool and then recombine it. It's just a real pain. But when you do this work within BigQuery, like I showed you before, your segments you can kind of capture however you want, and you bubble them up as a standard kind of pre-calced metric, and then you've got yourself a numerator and denominator, and again, unlimited total control. If you were trying to seat yourself to GA, you'd have to have all this foresight to set a goal, and you only have a certain number of goals. Even if you set a goal, it can only be applied in the future, not retroactively. This unlocks all of that. You're just kind of, the stress is gone.
Maybe we should do the example of shoppers on Nest.com. That was a good insight you had.
Yeah, that was another kind of game-changing moment in the way that we did analysis and looked for growth opportunities. Nest.com, you can do all sorts of things there. You can control your devices. You can get support. You can work with pro partners. So only a limited segment of our total visit population are these shoppers. And in fact, if you had a big support issue, you'd have a burst in traffic, but and a decline in conversion rate when really your shopper metric was totally unaffected. And so we really had to figure out a way to not only pull those shoppers out as a segment, but then also that needed to become the de facto denominator in all of our calculations. And anything you stack on top of it kind of had to take that as a given. So we defined a shopper and again started building metrics on top of it. How many shoppers were, what percent of shoppers were going through this specific flow? What percent of shoppers were buying like a mixed transaction with more than one piece of core hardware in it? And again, these calcs had just been out of our reach before. So this was a real game changer using BigQuery to mash all this together and then Tableau to visualize. And then finally, just to ice this cake a bit, I love to take the segmented metrics that I've built in BigQuery and turn them into dimensions using a case statement. And I think you can probably, you could use this case statement in either Tableau or BigQuery, but it is still the fundamental work the groundwork that you've laid that enables this. And what this is referring to is, usually you're stuck with the dimensions that you have to do your kind of slices and comparisons. Country, device category, channel, things like that. But really, when you want to know the impact of using a thing versus not using a thing, if you want to be able to compare that fluidly in Tableau, you need to be able to treat that as a dimension. And so using a case statement, you take these underlying rules that you've built, and you simply say, okay, well, if they did this thing, you name them one thing. If they didn't do it, you name them something else. And boom, you can do this concept that, at least at Nest, we refer to by slicing by or coloring by, to take all of the metrics you've built below, all the calculated metrics, and simply chop them by the dimension you just outlined. So, this is in this false example. If we had a way to infer that what someone's dietary preference was based on some series of actions they could take, we can build those as metrics that would flag those sessions. And then you use case statements to just kind of separate each group into each other. And then all of the conversion rate metrics, segmentation, traffic metrics, everything you kind of make beneath that can now be sliced by this new magical inference dimension that you've pulled out above. So pretty great stuff. And again, huge supercharge to the analysis we've done.
Stakeholders feel very empowered when they can play around with the interface to make it reflect what they want to see. It also is the case then that if it all lives in one viz, that if you need to make formatting changes or incorporate new data sources later on, you don't have to do that times 5 if you've got that built into the slice by or color by. It's all in one place.
Yeah, and again, this isn't really the same thing as just using the grouping functionality on normal GA data. You actually need that data to come through BigQuery to be where you're building metrics off of the segments in the first place. And then once you've done that, you can really transform their utility with this. All right, well, hopefully we can convince you at least a little bit that using BigQuery can give you far more power when looking for marketing and growth opportunities. Now, we'll share a few tips and tricks on how we use traditional Tableau capabilities layered on top of this stuff that we've unlocked with BigQuery to, again, really power up our marketing and business opportunities.
When you're evaluating marketing performance, it's very straightforward to divide revenue and cost and call that ROAS, or return on ad spend. The challenge is if you're selling something that itself has cost, a cost of goods sold, then by the time you've pulled that out, what you thought was break even is actually quite unprofitable. So what you really want to do is look at margin or profit divided by cost. So if you have the concept for a given, say, hardware product of what it costs to make that product, you can create a reference table that has the price as well as the, say, profit per unit, and you can evaluate what you're spending on marketing relative to the profit that you're bringing into the company and see if your marketing is truly paying for itself. When it is, it's very easy to secure additional budget.
Yeah, and it's a lot nicer to do it this way than to ask your finance team if you can put your margin into a custom metric that flows over the open web. So it's an even kind of upgrade even from, I think, what normal GA capabilities we provide.
So another example, agencies can keep their secret sauce. So if your agency is going out and negotiating preferential costs with individual platforms, they may not want to share that, or it might be in the contract that it can't be shared. So they could create, for example, an aggregated view of their cost where it's aggregated at a level that it's consistent with their contract. They could put that, for example, into Google Sheets, which could be pointed to Tableau as an additional data source. So you can look at traffic, conversion, et cetera, and you can do it in the context of the cost that the agency is reporting to you. So it makes it easy to be compliant. Additionally, orders versus shipments. It might be the case that what you're seeing in GA is orders, but if you are actually shipping something, if you had pre-orders, if you had a backlog, if there's just some sort of delay with a supplier, there can be a gap between orders and shipments, and Tableau helps you to blend that data in and visualize the difference. It can be very handy, especially at peak times of year. Parameterizing dimensions. Sounds fancy because it is. So it's a classic Tableau feature. It becomes even more powerful if you have segments that you're working with. So you can create an if-then statement that powers a parameter and makes it easier for data consumers to filter and control the dashboard. So what you see here is the slice by example we were talking about before. So what you would do is you would create a calculated field in Tableau called, say, slice by, that then points at the output of a parameter. So that allows you to quickly toggle a dashboard between looking at everything cut by country versus looking at everything cut by device. Can be really handy when you're talking about conversion rates, for example. You might see a very different conversion rate on mobile versus tablet versus desktop. Then the most common we have is to look at, to jump in and out of, say, countries and regions.
Yeah. I mean, this was also, as we started to do more of these kind of metrics as dimensions concept, where you're taking your underlying KPIs, the core segmented traffic, a couple of your core metrics, and you're building all the visualizations you want from that, and then you use this parameter concept to start splitting by, all of the major metrics as dimensions that you've built up. again, finding opportunities is far more fluid, far more natural. And then also, as you make changes to some of these things, if you're trying to analyze the improvement to a conversion rate after having to watch a video or a number of videos or certain videos or engaging with certain features on your site, it's a very painful process of exploration in GA. But once there are parameters in Tableau, it's just a simple matter of flipping through and looking for what strikes you that day.
It's also, you can build the view around whatever the goals are for the business, so that as opposed to exposing kind of everything that is possible to look at, you narrow the stakeholders' field of view to only the things that are the goals for the year. So if they're working on conversion rate, you'd be looking at that just by country and device, as opposed to any other sort of possible dimension that you could want to get crazy with.
Cool. And finally, when using BigQuery with Tableau, again, I assume this is a bit of a choice you're making with most of the times you're going to have these two tools to interact, but you need to decide whether you want a pre-aggregated table or something closer to like a visit or session level table. And really, this is the tension and choice between do you want speed or do you want flexibility? Or in my case, are you complacent with laziness, or do you really demand complexity from the work that you're about to do? And really, for pre-aggregated tables, I think the single defining factor that's going to make it the most obvious choice is length of time and complexity of underlying query. If you've got a fairly complex query and you're trying to do analysis over 6, 12, 24, 36 months, it's best, if possible, to simplify it into a pre-aggregated table, and it'll be just moving lightning fast without any pause. So a lot easier to do historical analysis. If it's a relatively simple function, you just keep appending it to the same table, and it's kind of rolling on its own. Visit level tables, I tend to think of those more as an analyst tool than a shareable dashboard. They tend to move a lot slower if you have a lot of data, and they're way more flexible, so you don't need to think about every aggregation you're going to do up front. A classic example is something where there are many possible combinations of users that you would want to explore, and you don't want to have to pre-aggregate every possible one beforehand. So one of the cooler projects that we've done based on this technology, having a visit level table in BigQuery powering through, visualized through Tableau, was a product level funnel, starting from the earliest point in the shopping flow where you could engage with that product, which is different for each product, and then showing the fall off as you went through to conversion. And a single person could, and often did, engage with multiple product funnels in a single visit. So you couldn't possibly have had an outer table that really kind of summed all that up without having just hundreds of rows, hundreds of lines of SQL code. And so with an inner query and a little work in Tableau, we got to the answers we needed, and it was just phenomenally insightful. Not something I share with the general public of data consumers at Nest, but it was super helpful for us growth analysts looking for product level opportunities. And to wrap things up, here is just my go-to list of the dimensions as they appear in BigQuery. They might seem a little random or ad hoc to you guys, but out of the 200 plus dimensions that I use in BigQuery for GA data, this represents 90% of them, and I get really, really far out of just this stuff. So, again, I can't encourage you enough to check out that integration if you haven't already. It's a order of magnitude difference in the power that you get as an analyst.
So stay tuned for live Q&A. We'll be back in less than a minute. Welcome back. So we've got some Q&A we'll be going through now. We've got some good questions. So first question, how do you account for discrepancies between what you see in Google Analytics and what you get from BigQuery? So great question, does come up from time to time. I can think of two sort of classic examples of where you'd see this. So one would be if you are looking at a long time series, for example, if you wanted to evaluate the last 3 Black Fridays that you'd had some sort of campaign or promotion around, you're pulling in 3 years of data. With Google Analytics, you'd get into sampling. So at a week level, you would start to see discrepancies between what were the actual data's, the actual, say, visits in BigQuery versus the sampled view of that from GA. So sampling could be one reason why you would have a discrepancy. Another kind of classic reason might be that you have actually structured the BigQuery segment, for example, that you're treating as kind of the source of truth for, say, sessions. Maybe the shopper example is a good one, to exclude support traffic or to exclude traffic to forums. So it's intended to leave certain things out, whereas GA might be bringing in more raw data. So in that case, the BigQuery was intended to be the source of truth, and it's off in a purposeful way.
Yeah, that was actually something I got a lot over when I first introduced shopper traffic as a metric, is not very easily or at all discoverable within Google Analytics, because you had to do some segmentation magic, much of which was only available through what I was doing in BigQuery. And so I had to kind of retrain a lot of our data consumers as to what the source of truth was for certain types of questions. And once it kind of became the nomenclature, people accepted, oh, the shopper thing is a thing we get from Tableau, and people went to the GA interface less and less if that's not a question that they felt like they needed the answer there.
Yes. So let's see. So the next question, what have been some of the most insightful analysis projects using Tableau and BigQuery? Great question. So I think GA by default ends up doing a lot of last click attribution when you're looking at marketing. So you'll get a lot of credit for search. And less so for display, typically display advertising. What we started doing was to fold in aggregated data out of DoubleClick. We had some rules set up around how to attribute revenue back to display advertising. So we had that aggregated and calculated, and then we would kind of compare that to channel level traffic and activity that we were seeing in GA. And you could map one against the other to say, okay, how's our marketing doing holistically or at a channel level? And gave us the freedom to invest more actively in display advertising.
Yeah. There's also one of the, other than the product funnel one, which was one of my earliest proud sculptures that I built, was that I worked with a couple other analysts to form up a kind of a visitor table or visitor ID table that would give us a sense of who is a likely customer, even if they weren't logged in. We don't necessarily track any customer identification level stuff in our GA instance particularly, but we do have a lot of signals that they're a customer, namely that we know if they bought something from the store, we can flag that Google Analytics visitor ID as a customer. If they came from an email that only went to customers, we know that as well. And so we kind of built this rough table that gave us an approximation of who our known customers were, and we could start to segment by that data, just customer versus non-customer traffic, and also incredibly insightful, again, when you have no other way, especially other than maybe whether they're logged in or not, as to whether that person was a customer. And huge growth opportunities were found through that.
Yeah. Let's see, next question. Can you get real-time Google Analytics data through BigQuery?
Much to Alex's disbelief, you actually can get it. I think it was launched sometime around last year. With real-time, it was one of the kind of last remaining vestiges and benefits of going through the Google Analytics interface. But getting it into the BigQuery data set and then piping it over to Tableau has been really phenomenal for our dev teams who do a lot of uptime monitoring, just kind of like day-to-day check-in. They've obviously got lots of other uptime tools, but they'll blend those together and watch QPS or rather more QPM queries per minute, site traffic per minute, and just general volume. We also use it around launch dates when we're pulling in lots of real-time data
the war room.
as fresh as possible. And being about 15 minutes fresh gives us the impact of individual press releases or individual cycles that we put out there. And yeah, real-time data through BigQuery has been just lightning hot when it's needed.
So let's see, next question. What's the advantage of using Tableau over Google's Data Viz product?
Yeah, I think they're talking about Google Data Studio, which I've had a lot of experience with as well. Both are phenomenal products, both have a connection to BigQuery. Tableau has a few advantages when you're doing some of the more complex dashboard development or the analysis that we talk a lot about, the parameterizing dimensions and kind of slice by, and some instances of color by. You just have more control. Google's Data Studio, I love it that you have a single canvas and you're kind of painting the elements of the dashboard on there, so you don't need the complexity of like one sheet per graph like you need with Tableau. You can just kind of work from one or two canvas spaces and just mix and match as you need. So they're also just the same as Tableau and GA, kind of situational, but both have a BigQuery connection, so I've used them both.
Terrific. That's all for today. Please tune in next Tuesday for the next Cloud on Air. Thank you for watching.